and we can get going. So, I don't remember what I'm doing. I'm totally disoriented. Right, so what we're trying to cover this evening, there's really quite a lot. The prelude, I've called it, is actually handing back to Suzanne, because we ran out of time last week, and she's just going to finish up with some extra information around some of the really valuable resources that you might go and reference in your research in evidence-based practice areas and things like that. So she will explain those. And then there's like two or sort of different parts. There's two main bits, and a few things happen at the end as well. So the first part of the main content of this evening after Suzanne is to explain a little bit about the research environment, so that you understand again that context of where health and medical science research takes place. Then there's a part around research methodologies. A little bit of introductory material, not too much, but leading into a really, really good video that we'll ask you to view, which is on study designs, particularly in evidence-based practice. So that's really quite a critical bit for you to listen into, to watch. We've got guest speakers as well. So that's coming up at the end. Another video, they pre-recorded it, and that is then, just trying to find the right information there, that is Ruth Mitchell and Catherine King, and they're going to talk specifically about standards for systematic reviews and the work that they've been involved in there. So a lot of information that is very, very valuable to you before we move on to week 8 next week, where Suzanne is back again to talk about critical appraisal and the activities involved there. So this is scaffolding your way through all of that. So a lot to cover, but hopefully you will be able to break it up into different components, and we'll just try and make sure that the time fits everything that we want to do. So I'm going to hand back to Suzanne while she's here and ask you to talk about Joanna Briggs and everything that's behind that. Thank you, Suzanne.
All right, thank you very much, Jill, and welcome back, everyone. And at the end of last week's presentation on evidence-based practice, we were looking at some evidence-based practice information tools, and we looked in some detail at the Cochrane Library, and which, as you'll remember, is a library of systematic reviews. This week I'm just going to talk very briefly about two other resources. The first one being the Joanna Briggs Institute. Now, this is a not-for-profit body engaged in research and development of evidence-based resources focused on the fields of nursing, midwifery and allied health. So whereas the Cochrane Library was developed primarily by doctors and is generally aiming for medical specialists as its audience, the Joanna Briggs Institute does a very similar thing, but with the focus on nursing and allied health. It's based in the University of Adelaide in South Australia, but it is an international body, and it has lots of collaborating centres all over the world. And the output of the Joanna Briggs Institute is located in the Joanna Briggs Library, similar to the Cochrane Library. And some of the resources in this library are open access, but some require a subscription. And the resources include evidence-based practice publications such as systematic reviews, best practice sheets, and so on. So this is a screenshot from the QUT library website, And it shows you that the QUT subscription to the Joanna Briggs Institute gives you access via the Joanna Briggs JBI Connect website or via an Ovid search interface. The JBI Connect, going straight into the website, usually gives you access to a few more resources than the Ovid interface. And the list at the bottom of the slide shows you the kinds of publications that you can find there, including evidence summaries, information sheets, systematic reviews, and so on. Now, I'm just going to show you very briefly JBI through the Ovid interface, because this is the one that I have access to in New South Wales. And while universities tend to have access to the full JBI site, some hospitals only have access to the resources that are available through Ovid. So this is the Ovid homepage, and it's set on the basic search option, and I think this should be familiar to some of you. And in the basic search, I've just put the term pressure ulcers, and just below that search box I've selected, I've limited the publication year to a range of 2010 to current. You can limit by publication type if you wish. I haven't put a limit in there at this initial search. And you can also limit to subject area nodes. And I limited to wound healing and management, which is fairly obvious with a topic such as pressure ulcers. So when I did this search, I got 27 results, and then I went on and added a publication type limit for evidence summaries, and that reduced the number of results to 19. It's not a big database. It doesn't have vast numbers of records in it, and sometimes you'll do a search and you won't find very much at all. But if you do find some material on your topic, it's a very, very useful site for clinical questions relating to nursing and midwifery. And this is a screenshot of an evidence summary that came up in my list of results, and it's on pressure area care management. And it's a really good illustration of the value of these evidence summaries in ensuring that nursing care is based on best evidence. So each evidence summary answers a clinical question, and in this case the question is, what is the best available evidence regarding the management of pressure area care? And you can see that it's dated the 8th of the 1st, 2016, so it's very recent. Now, an evidence summary, the term is used fairly loosely, but in the context of the Joanna Briggs Institute, it's basically it's like a very condensed version of a systematic review. So what happens is that usually the Joanna Briggs Institute, one of the groups will do a systematic review on a topic such as pressure area care, and then from the results of that systematic review, they will then produce some associated publications such as evidence summaries, recommended practices, best practice sheets, and that kind of thing, which are usually only a couple of pages long. So this evidence summary, it starts with, as they all do, it starts with a clinical bottom line, which summarises the summary. Again, it's very, very helpful for time-poor clinicians. They're very well referenced. There's a reference list available at the end of the document, and they're usually only 4 or 5 pages long. And there's also a section on characteristics of the evidence, which appraises the quality of the evidence, followed by some best practice recommendations. So that's just a very brief look at the Joanna Briggs Institute, and as with the Cochrane Library, if you have time to just go in to those resources through the QUT library or through your own institution and just have a look at them, that's really, really helpful to do that. And the final resource that I wanted to show you is the TRIP database. TRIPS is actually an acronym. It stands for Turning Research into Practice. And TRIP is a clinical search engine that's designed to allow users to very quickly and easily find and use high quality research evidence to support their practice. It's been around for quite a few years now, and it's just freely available online. So this is the TRIP homepage, and as you can see, there's a search box and there's several search options. It always defaults to the basic search, but there is an advanced search and there's also a PICO search option. And you'll remember from last week we looked at the acronym PICO, Population Intervention Comparison Outcome. Now, the advanced search is only open to TRIP Pro users, and this means that you have to register and sign up and I think pay some money. I've never done that, never paid any money. You can just stick to the basic search and the PICO search and just use TRIP for free. And this is a screenshot of the PICO search in TRIP. And I've populated it with the elements of one of the PICOs that we did last week that you worked through on your worksheet. So this was the use of transient elastography for monitoring liver fibrosis in obese patients with hepatitis C. Now, this, of course, was not a treatment question, it was a diagnosis question, but it still fits quite nicely into this PICO search screen. So our population is obese patients with hepatitis C. The intervention, which in this case is a diagnostic tool, is transient elastography. The comparison I put in, because I happen to know what it is the gold standard for diagnosis, which is a liver biopsy, but you don't have to put that in the comparison box. You don't have to fill every box. And the outcome is fibrosis. And in fact, the outcome is accurate detection of fibrosis, but you can just put in the word fibrosis. And this is a screenshot of the first few results of the search, where I got 34 results altogether. Now, the results are presented in order of relevance according to the TRIP algorithm, and there's quite a lot of information about that on the TRIP website. One very useful feature of TRIP is that the results can be filtered by evidence type using the Refine Results feature on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you're looking for a quick answer, and this is a tool designed for that, you could go to the right-hand side of the screen and you could choose to, for example, look at just the evidence-based synopses or just the systematic reviews or just the Australian and New Zealand guidelines. And in fact, the first result in this list, supersonic shear imaging and transient elastography with the extra large probe accurately detect fibrosis in overweight or obese patients with chronic liver disease, that in fact answered our question quite well. And this is the screenshot of the record. It's a search engine, it's not a full text database, so you don't necessarily get the full text, but you do get the reference, the article and the abstract. And even from the abstract, it gives us the answer to the question. So they had 258 obese patients with chronic liver disease, and all the patients underwent the two kinds of imaging, and 124 of them also had the liver biopsy. And they looked at the estimates of fibrosis in each patient for both kinds of imaging, and both techniques were found to accurately quantify liver fibrosis compared to the liver biopsy. So that's that's just an overview of what we did last week, and then the last two elements on there are just what we've covered tonight. So I will leave you with those tools to explore, and I'll hand back to Jill.
Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. Any questions around those for Suzanne while she's here then? Again, if something comes to you during the week, pop it into the Facebook site. Suzanne's watching that, and she can give you some support and help and guidance that way. So again, while you've got access to the QT resources, if you're not normally in that situation, certainly get into the Joanna Briggs and see what is available there and how it's structured and the type of information that you can access. It's a great opportunity. Right, okay, so we will move on to proper week 7 now, and take a look at basically the health and medical research context in Australia. We've been sort of bandying around all of this information about health research and medical research and everything, but what does it actually look like? Who's involved? Where does the money come from? And all of those type of things. So, if it moves, thank you. So the philosophy is very much that health and medical research contributes to improvements in human health and well-being. The goal in most Western societies would be that people live longer, they remain healthier through good quality healthcare. And there's also an argument, a financial argument, economic argument, that medical research contributes to the national wealth through a range of innovative industries. So we'll take a look at some of the things that are happening in that area. A bit of history to start with. Medical education and research goes back to 1862 here in Australia with the University of Melbourne. Another 21 years, in fact, before the University of Sydney got involved in the space. The Australian Institute of Tropical Medicine in Townsville, interestingly that regional aspect there, came in early in the 20th century and has been followed by a number of different institutions with the, you've probably heard about the National Health and Medical Research Council, so the NHMRC, that fund a lot of the research in this country. That was established and introduced in 1936. Today, obviously, it's burgeoned. There are very many dedicated research centres and institutions which we'll touch on to look at some of the range of different organisations that are involved. A place you can go to look at this, if you are interested to drill down and learn more about it, the Association of Australian Medical Research Institutes, that is there as a collective almost to track the different organisations and to serve as a lobby group to promote the value of health and medical research across this country as well. So the different areas might include medical research institutes, referred to as MRIs, universities themselves, as well as clinical settings as hospitals, medical centres. And then we can't leave out the biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies, so industry is involved in there as well. So quite a range of different organisations that you need to be aware of. That's just a screenshot which shows the first sort of little bit around some of their members. It goes on for a vast number of pages, as you can imagine, from A to Z, but it gives you an idea about the range of different areas of research, quite specialized, obviously, areas of research, considering diabetes, vision, sort of cancer medicine, all those different areas. So they're also good sources of information if you're wanting to explore a particular area of medical research. There's another organisation, Research Australia, and that's an alliance, again, of a number of different organisations. They're working together to ensure that health and medical research is a true national priority and to have some influence into policy making. One of their roles is to actually monitor the financial side, so looking at the funding that goes into health research, but also then the return on investment, what's coming out of it. So here again, 170 different organisations are involved, covering that whole spectrum, as you can see there, the academic world, specialised research institutes, the clinical setting, philanthropy and industry. They put together a very good report in 2011 which looked at trends and statistics in funding. It hasn't been updated since 2011, but as I say, the idea of tracking trends, they really show some of the, visually some of the data going into this whole context of health and medical research. So the background to some of the funding, very quickly to take a look at that. Lots of dollars. Okay, so here it just states from their research facts that it's almost $6 billion is spent on health and medical research in Australia every year. And then it just drills down into the R&D aspects, how much of that, sort of 8% of all health expenditure is actually research focused. And it's presented there that 37% of GDP went into health and medical research. So this is a significant sector of the economy in this country. Beyond that, it gets broken down. This comes from the government's website, the Department of Health, and that shows you in the pie chart how the dollars are distributed, or where they come from, rather. So Commonwealth government funding, almost half of it comes from the Commonwealth government, and state government is much smaller. Only 11% is coming out of that. But then there's commercial, there's philanthropy, so donations and fundraising, so there from that. There's investment income and then other income. So this just gives you a very sort of like quick overview of how the dollars come into the system. So some of the features, what's happening in the area, you can tell from that if you aggregate the Commonwealth and state government funding. The research is heavily reliant on government funding for both basic and applied science. Where industry and venture capital come into play is very much around trialling, testing, commercialization of new discoveries and things like that. There's also a big, large efforts are really being made to increase philanthropic funding. So that's a growth area for many areas of research. But it's subject very much to the changing environment, and if you follow the political situations in this country, then you're aware that there are a huge amount of competing pressures on where the dollars should be spent. And so there are different activities, different factors. For example, just the aging of the population. You're probably aware that that's going to put great pressure on health funding across the country. And so social changes like that are going to have a lot of impetus into the research dollars as well. But government spending priorities come into play. In terms of the investment, we also look at the skilled, highly paid workforce as being a huge element of the economic structure of health and medical research. It's stressed very strongly that there's increasing competition for research funding as universities are looking for other avenues of funding as well. Then there's been a huge increase in the number of applications for funding. So just over that 3-year period of 2012 to 2014, it was over 3 times an increase. So 300% to 350% increase in terms of the number of applications going in for funding. And that grew from 130 applications to 484 applications. So huge competition for the research dollar. And that needs to be considered by everybody in the activities. The trends that are actually happening in this space, the increase in health research spending and health generally has certainly outpaced the growth in GDP, and that is, again, driven by demographic change. And so there's a bit of a breakdown there of the different areas of where the corporate sector is involved, investing in it, but also then philanthropic investment. But in terms of, even though the Australian spend is going up, other countries it's going up at a higher amount. So it's actually dropping in terms of OECD comparisons. And this is particularly noticeable in the emerging economies such as Russia, India, China, even Brazil are really investing very heavily in health and medical research where they hadn't done in the past. So that graph there shows you just visually where Australia fits in terms of health and research development funding as a percentage of GDP in 2014. So that gives you a feel that we're still quite a long way down the line, really, in terms of what's happening, but there's a lot of change in other areas. So that gives you just a quick overview. In terms of the return on investment, okay, so why do we do it? What do we get out of it with all of these funding? Traditionally, the focus has been on research output, on scholarly publications, and those of you working in academic libraries are only too familiar with all of this. But there's also a growing interest in the impact of the research, the outcomes of it. So not just the development of new knowledge, but where there's influence, how this influences policy development, how it influences the new drug options and new medical devices that are available to patients, and how through the outcomes of research, patient treatments improve, the models of care improve, meaning that people stay in hospital longer, which has a direct impact on health funding, of course. And then overarchingly, the sort of health outcomes for both individuals and the population as a whole. And ultimately, the goal of some of the research is to reduce the direct costs of healthcare overall. So that's things to consider there. This picture here shows you how that gets broken down, and some of this will get discussed in some of the ideas around study designs as well. So from a basic concept and basic research going through a longitudinal stage to community benefit. There's lots of different steps involved where you've got the basic research, which then translates into applied research, proof of concept, then preclinical and clinical situations, regulatory approval, and ultimately community benefit. And how the funding differs across that line. So NHMRC funding, government funding, and philanthropy tend to be sort of down the sort of the real research end, whereas industry is coming in on the more clinical side, looking at some of the drugs and the investment from that side of things. So different ways along that continuum. This just tracks what's been happening in terms of the research output in terms of scholarly publications. And the picture that's shown there is the number of publications that have been published, obviously, over that different period of time. And then also the little diamond gives you the percentage of top cited publications. So you could argue that Australia is punching above its weight, so to speak, that in terms of the number of publications that are presented and published, there's quite a high impetus there to have top cited publications in there as well. So it's a different graph to sort of translate some of that research. Another important angle that we need to be very aware of is the area of international collaboration. Those of you in the academic sector are probably very aware about the big push towards far greater international collaboration, interinstitutional collaboration as well, so across this country as well as overseas. And you can see that from the figures there that way back in 1993-94, international collaboration, or the publications, were around 20%, and that's doubled by 2009. In that period, then 40% of the publications were already involving international collaboration. And today, I couldn't track any exact data, but obviously that's going to increase over the past 6 or 7 years as well. So NHMRC has got very dense data that you can, lots of Excel spreadsheets and things like that, that looks at the actual international partnerships and collaborations. So that's really tracked very strongly and is encouraged, and obviously technology supports all of that. So just dropping back to the actual ROI, the return on investment in terms of health improvements, we can probably say that life expectancy is continuing to increase and that death rates related to disease and injuries are falling. And there have been some significant contributors by Australian researchers in this area. So the examples that you've got on the screen there with the HPV for cervical cancer, the vaccine that young girls get these days, spray on skin for burns victims, swine flu vaccines. A lot of innovative activity comes out of Australia and is world recognised for that. Nevertheless, there's lots of challenges, and you'll probably be aware of this just if you sort of are aware of what the government discussions, political discussions are about. The fact that we are living longer is putting great pressure on revenue coming into the government, of course, and so slower economic growth is being predicted, but also then increased demand. So where does our tax dollar go if there continues to be increased demand for the services and funding for age-related services? However, at the same time, we are expecting immense developments in terms of the technology. If you think how fast technology is changing, the rapid opportunities for new technology to be applied in the health sector. Our expectations, the consumer is expecting higher quality health services, and so this has a financial influence then as well. So there's those that do all of the planning around the economy, etc., are really expecting a huge increase in spending on health services. So therefore, there's also going to be a lot of further investment needed to go into health and medical research across that time. So in terms of sources of funding, we sort of said the government, 40% of Commonwealth government, 40% of the funding comes from Commonwealth government funding, and these are the main areas, the organisations that contribute. The Department of Health itself, the NHMRC, but then also through the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, the ARC, cooperative research centres, and also then CSIRO themselves. They're all involved in that research environment and manage and deliver a lot of different programs. It's going a bit funny here. In terms of the Department of Health, they've got their own priority areas, and this is where sort of a lot of lobbying, advocacy, the development of what is the greatest priorities. And currently, it's been reported that the priority areas cover those on the screen there. So communicable diseases, immunisation in terms of influenza and childhood vaccination programs, cancer, diabetes, mental health. And then also there's been quite a lot of funding going into medical research infrastructure, so actual capital works, because to undertake high quality research you need the right research environment, and that involves buildings and sort of the areas, labs and various things that are going to be of the quality where that research can take place, and that all requires investment in its own right. The NMHRC remains obviously one of the key areas, and going back, it was launched in 1936, and it came with the sort of Minister for Health saying at that time that research should be actively pursued and developed. And as fast as new knowledge is acquired, it must be applied. And that's one of the big challenges, is to fast track that developmental stage and get it from the research elements into applied clinical environments as well. And so when it was established, the objectives were very much to raise the standard of health in Australia, to foster consistent health standards, and we'll look at some of that a little bit later, to ensure that we have a trained health research workforce, and to develop a framework of research ethics, and we'll touch on some of that later as well. So I'm sure you can understand that we have travelled a very long way since 1936, and but the formation of the organisation was important. This just shows the past 15 years on the actual spending. So just looking at the trend line, how much it has actually increased on an annual basis. And that's just up to, sorry, it's a 10-year period. It doesn't go up to today, but it's projected into the next few years as well. But you can see a really rapid increase from around $200 and something million right the way up to $800 and something million today. So vast increase in investment. Suzanne commented there, sorry I missed that as you put through, but international collaboration, Cochrane and Joanna are really strong areas of that international collaboration. Another busy graph, but this shows the milestones just for the NHMRC. And again, just look at the trend data, that it has increased so exponentially up to that sort of 2013 period, and it tracks a few of the milestones. So at the very right down at the very beginning, it's probably very small on your screen, but it goes back to 1937, and it says that the first appropriation into research funding was £30,000, as it was at that stage, which was equivalent through inflation, etc., to about $25 million. And now we're talking that it's up in the $800 million, so a huge increase over the historical period. That just shows, again, a little bit of the data, the actual funding data. Just the fact that since 1995, so that's what, a 20-year period, it has gone up fivefold. Just shows you the trends. The distribution, I think, is also quite interesting as to where the centre, the sort of the research is happening and who is being funded. Victoria accounts for almost 40% of the research funding from NHMRC, compared to Western Australia, which receives only 6%. We talked earlier to sort of say that there's greater competition. That means that the quality of research proposals is improving, but because of the competition, increasing numbers of proposals actually fail to be funded. So it's been argued that 80% of the proposals really are fundable. They are legitimate, valid, important areas of research, but only 23% of those actually receive funding from NHMRC. So you can see why there's a push to increase philanthropic and business funding into medical research as well. Part of the problems associated with grant funding, and anybody in the academic environment can relate to this, is if everything is project-based, where is the, how do researchers establish a career? How do they sustain a career? And what is the actual impact of attrition of people leaving the environment because of the fight to get paid positions based on a research career? So that's a real concern. Cecily just dropped in there to say that she read lately that it's now less than 20% get actual funding. So, yep, so that's showing that it's continuing to drop as the increase. I mean, that reflects that huge increase of, 130 to 400 and something applications that were received in the past year or so. So, it's very aggressive out there. Going back to the states and territories, this gives you a screenshot of how it's divided up. The ratios have remained pretty similar, I would argue. If you look different, the bands of colour there, that hasn't changed significantly. So even though the funding is increased, the ratio of how it's divvied up across the different states has remained pretty much proportional. So Victoria is the strong winner. And anybody sort of associated with that sort of area knows the intensity of some of the research agencies, the space that the land that they cover in sort of that Parkville area of Melbourne is really important. So that's just to give you an idea of how it's travelling. So where does NHMRC and ARC, where do they push their funds out to? Very much the universities and the research institutes, of course. So they are, so there's a balance. The universities that need to get funds from other areas as well, but it's arguably saying that 25% of university research and development activity goes to health and medical research. And therefore, as funds get cut back in universities, it gets, I suppose, more important that it is available. So the medical schools, that just gives you the snapshot of the number of medical schools in Australia. If you weren't aware about where they were all happening, it gives you a quick overview, and you can come back to that to take a greater look. Research institutes, this is just a very quick sample, of course, but those are the type of organisations which receive a considerable amount of funding through NHMRC. So across the country there are different ones. You'll probably be familiar with some of the names there. This gives you the balance, if you like, a comparative balance of how much goes into the academic sector and how much into dedicated research institutes. So you can see that universities receive a vast amount, a good proportion of that funding. A quarter to a third of the funding goes to research institutes and the balance to universities. But you can see that's, again, that rise of the trends over time. So, of course, it's not as clean-cut as all of that. The push for collaboration means that there's a lot of interaction between the universities, the research institutes, and the clinical environment of hospitals. The impact of evidence-based medicine is very much about working out ways to translate research quite rapidly, more rapidly, from the research environment, so from the lab, from the bench, to the bedside, and to ensure that patients benefit from new discoveries and new knowledge in a speedier way. I mentioned before the infrastructure. This is just here to give you a bit of idea of how important that is as well. It was set up in 2008 as part of the GFC strategies, so investment in building, and a number of major infrastructure projects benefited from that, as you can see, across the country. So the Eccles Institute at the ACT, the Ingham Health Institute, and Hunter Medical Research Institute received quite substantial amounts of money to improve the research environment to ensure better research comes out of it. Beyond that, there's departmental funding from industry, innovation and science. The cooperative research centres, if you're familiar with those, they're normally based at universities, but they're sort of collaborative partnerships between publicly funded research and then outside organisations as well. The requirements are that a university or research institute affiliated with the university has to be involved, but then end users are also connected with it and contribute to the whole process. So that's a good area to be in. The ARC, again, if you're in the academic environment, you understand the battle, the prestige that accompanies grant funding through the ARC, and there's a number of different types of grants, and a lot of sort of allied health areas are funded through ARC rather than necessarily through NHMRC. So those areas on the screen there, psychology, immunology, pharmacology, etc., etc. There are different ways of getting through their grant schemes, the discovery projects, linkage grants, future fellowships, etc. So another avenue for people to get involved in. And again, just that trend line that sort of compares NHMRC research grants with ARC across the board. This slide gives you a quick picture on health research specifically by sources of funding, looking at Australian government, so Commonwealth funding, as opposed to state funding, as opposed to non-government funding. And you can see from there how incrementally the Commonwealth government funding has increased compared with state and non-government funding as well. So that's important to note. So in terms of state funding, very often it's a collaborative activity again. So looking at industry input rather than straight state funding into various projects, they're expecting other partners to come in and contribute to that. So a good example here in Brisbane is the Translational Research Institute, which involves Ian Fraser, who's the developer of the HPV vaccine. There's funding coming in from both Commonwealth and Queensland governments. A major philanthropy area, Atlantic Philanthropies, are a major investor, but then also universities like QUT and University of Queensland. So all of those agencies working together, very much looking at that original sort of goal of getting bench to bedside medical research happening. So you can investigate that in more detail if you like. Where's industry involved? Business expenditure tends to go into R&D, pharmacology, clinical sciences, biotechnology, those sort of areas. Very often their listed companies get involved, so they get investment from investors, naturally. So on the ASX, there's a health index, there's a biotech daily top 40 index. So looking at community investment, industry investment into those areas. The pharmaceutical industry, farmers attract a lot of bad press, of course, as well as good press, but they're looking at next generation healthcare solutions, and it's estimated that there's over $1 billion being invested through the pharmaceutical industry. 14,000 people are employed, so there again, you know, that's a major sector of the economy that is going into that. And a lot of it is associated with clinical trials, and that we'll sort of look at, obviously, in some of the evidence-based, the clinical, sort of critical appraisal areas about how clinical trials are conducted and what the outcomes are. There's a big medical technology industry increasingly around medical devices, all the medical consumables. If you think of hospitals and how many resources they need in terms of bandages and medication, all the different activities that go on within the hospital environment, medical imaging equipment, etc. And that can go literally from really quite sophisticated devices through to the consumables like bandages and things. So that's an industry in itself. Just quickly on philanthropy, I think we will say that compared to some other countries, Australia is not a strong philanthropic community, so quite low by international standards. And in the areas of public donations, it's very often, I suppose, a personal bias, if you want to call it that. If a member of the family or has been involved in a certain health dilemma, then it might be cancer, it might be liver problems or something. Some of the philanthropy will come as direct funding into those areas because of the care and the understanding about the research that is required. A telephone survey that was done a couple of years ago sort of said that consumers will be actually very happy to pay $1 more as a donation for every time that they sort of have a prescription filled, if they knew that that money was going to health and medical research. So there's probably opportunities to increase the just community investment into health and medical research in different ways. In terms of future directions of where the funding might go, there's a number of reports have been presented in recent times about how to improve some of those areas. We are becoming much more aware. That came out, I think, in week 1 around the need to understand that the consumer themselves is taking a stronger understanding about their own health and wanting to participate in decisions about their own healthcare. So that's going to shift in some areas. Could also encourage this to be a source of philanthropy as we have a more informed consumer environment, as people understand more about what's required to establish good health arrangements. So encouraging health services to get directly involved in some of the research activities can be that translational area, research being translated into practice. Looking at the ways in which clinicians can critically appraise research outcomes. So a big push, I know, sort of in medical courses, critical appraisal is a big ticket item to ensure that the students who graduate are going to have those skills, because it's going to be so important in their things. Sorry, I went too fast on that one. Other strategies, looking at medical devices. It's expected that that's going to have a lot of changing practice which will improve health outcomes for individuals. Encouraging collaboration by providing incentives and reducing barriers, and very much ensuring that that career pathway is managed in a better way to be sustainable, to attract high quality researchers and ensure that they do see it as a career and not just a project-based activity that when funding is lost, their career goes down the drain as well. So there's a big push as well to say that there needs to be more joining the dots in terms of some of the funding to make sure that it is ongoing and reliable and sustainable, and then encouraging further commercial investment, and really having a strategic national approach to understanding the role of research in that sort of translation into healthcare. So there's a big search requirement, I suppose, to ensure that there's not pockets of money, but it's actually joined up in a different, stronger way. So there was a big review undertaken in 2013, which is referred to as the McKeon Review, the Strategic Review of Health and Medical Research. So if you're interested in this area, that provides a very comprehensive, cohesive picture of the history of what's been going on, but then also where the future directions are going to be going. Certainly, the strong understanding that it needs to have research capacity, health professionals who are embedded in this area, to have integrated health research centres. So a lot of great ideas, but of course they all need funding. And so that's the big sort of policy development area. There's a couple of slides here around, what are the priorities and where are they going? How are the dollars divvied up across the different areas? The health spend, biomedical science attracts around $365 million. That's $1 million a day. Clinical medicine and science, and then public health and health services. So you can see from that, if health services, those activities are divided up across those. That's graphically presenting how that looks and how it's changed over those periods of 5-year periods for that. The direct beneficiaries, the areas of, we talked about the priorities earlier, whether it was, cancer, mental health, etc. This shows you the proportion of research funding that goes into those different areas, again with a bit of a timeline going across it. So you can see the major recipient is the area of cancer. That's a lilac shade in the graph. But then increasing funding going into the growth areas, if you like, indigenous health, mental health, those sort of areas are actually increasing in relation to the others as well. So that shows the priorities in this country of what's required. Certainly indigenous health is an important area, and Early research tended to be observational, whereas since 2002, the NHMRC has adopted Indigenous health research as a strategic priority. So it has attracted, a lot more funding going into that area. And there's also, importantly, the equal aspects of research with sort of communities in that area. So that was a lot of information in a very short space of time, but hopefully it's given you just a bit of a broader understanding. I wouldn't say it'd be deep in any sense, but an understanding about the different organisations involved, the funding sources, and some of the priorities that are in place, so that when you look at, I suppose, the organisations that you might already be associated with, look at the influences and how they impact on various things as well. Phew, that's a lot of information. Any questions at all? Or comments, from your own experience? Are there priorities in your own environments that you're aware of and how that comes into play? I can offer you the microphone if there's things that you would like to talk about. Just wait for some of the discussion to appear in the chat box there. Okay, Suzanne is saying that in the hospital setting, because that's her environment specifically, the priorities include clinical trials and translational research, so getting evidence into practice, so that bench to bedside side of things. So anything you want to add to that, Suzanne, in terms of explaining how those priorities translate, literally?
Well, I think, can you hear me, Jill?
Yes, we can. Yes, absolutely.
Yep. Certainly in my hospital,
Yes.
clinical trials are a major part of the research activity because, and they're usually multi-center clinical trials, so the trial team will be working across a number of different hospitals because our hospital is a good source of patients to be enrolled in trials. So there's a lot of activity in that area. And the translational research is big as well. And it's all about narrowing that evidence practice gap and narrowing the time it takes to get evidence into practice. And when we heard last week from Anne Purcell about using Emla cream for pain control in lower leg ulcers, I mean, that's just a great example of how long it can take to get evidence into practice. And I suppose the third area that I didn't write about was clinical redesign. So that's a kind of, it's not pure research, biomedical research, but it is kind of applied research looking for best evidence on how we do things, how we could do things better. Yeah, so that's probably the areas of priorities for us.
Yes. Great. Okay, no, thank you. That sort of translates some of that sort of more abstract information into how it sort of distills in an actual hospital environment, which is really important. Robin has asked, will open access ever become more norm for information on clinical trials and clinical research? Any view on that? Suzanne, what's your thought? Or Cecily?
Well, I'm assuming that Robin means open access to the research publications that come out of clinical trials and other forms of research. And I think, yes, she's confirmed that. there certainly is a move towards open access. There's a move towards sharing the actual data sets, so researchers giving other researchers access to their raw data, and also publishing results of research in open access publications. And I think the NH&MRC either has or is about to mandate that if your research is publicly funded, or a percentage of it is publicly funded, you have to make your research available either through open access or through sharing data sets. I'd have to go back and check that, but I think that's the case.
Yes, no, I think you're correct in that. Yes, most of the funding bodies these days, if it is publicly funded, they're arguing that open access is the way to go. Plus, as you say, the data management side of things as well, access to the data, which is new avenues of career paths for obviously library and information professionals as well. So there's a big push within the universities, university libraries certainly, to get involved in data management as well. Stephanie has commented that there's also more interest in measuring outcomes of treatment or metrics for translating research into clinical uses. So from that, and Leslie's commented again, going back to the open access in the university setting, options for publishing formally and informally, so your green and gold or whatever. Institutional research repositories are a good source of open access publications, absolutely. So measuring outcomes is a big topic, says Stephen. I find it a hard topic to do a literature search on, or literature searches on. Cecily, any comment on that from your experience? Any guidance that you might be able to say? Take the microphone, feel free.
Thanks, Jill. I think that like Stephen, in the sense that it can be a very hard thing to pin down outcomes. I recall Lorena saying that when she does searches or advises people on searches, she says never put in the outcome that people claim they're looking for. So she's taking, in a circumstance of a systematic review, taking a very broad approach and allowing all the information to be retrieved, and then taking it back to the researchers to filter for the outcomes that they want. But Stephen and I aren't, because we're in a hospital environment, we can't always relax into that sort of mode. But I think overall, I know that there is a lot of discussion at the moment about determining some standard outcomes for clinical treatment, so that, obviously this is to allow greater comparability between various health providers on how well they perform. But there are still a lot of details to be pinned down. So a heart attack determined in one institution is not necessarily scored as a heart attack by people working in a separate institution, because they're using different criteria or slightly different criteria. So there's a lot of work still to be done on agreeing on what the measures might be before we can go further and say, yes, the research has achieved what we asked it to do.
Right, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I just see Stephen is sort of commenting further about he's working on a systematic review on total knee arthroplasty and BMI, but all the BMI outcome data is hidden in full text and so hard to search for, as it doesn't necessarily turn up in titles and abstracts. So exploring a few unorthodox search strategies to solve this. So I think you need to share those with us later, Stephen, once you've worked that one out. We're just after 7 o'clock, so I might sort of say let's take a quick break here. So allow the 10-minute break. So if you'd like to come back at 15:15, so 7:15, and we'll make sure that we've got more interesting content and some videos for you to watch and things like that as well. So if you'd like to go and take a break, and see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. Then a quantitative approach may be preferred. However, if researchers are interested in how individuals within a specific group of people perceive health and illness, then a qualitative approach will be better. So you're going to encounter both, all right, quantitative and qualitative, depending on what the question is. So quantitative, as you're naturally, I would hope, aware, that focuses much more on numerical and statistical data, is viewed as more objective. So it's an objective scientific measurement of the world. The world is, in fact, a collection of observable evidence and facts that can be measured. Okay, so that's the quantitative dimensions. Qualitative is more constructivist. It's looking at how people are engaged with their world. So it incorporates that idea that people are involved in interpreting their ever-changing world. So it's much more subjective. It's looking at social actions, social interactions, and the researcher is directly involved in the research as a research instrument, so asking questions, interacting with research participants. Quantitative, on the other hand, is, as I say, more objective. You're on the outer looking in. Qualitative, the researcher is in the inside, being involved in that process. It doesn't exclude the opportunity for some quantitative data, so demographics, for example, understanding who the research subjects are. That is really important to get some of that demographic. That might be considered quantitative data, sorry. That just gives you a quick overview of some of the sort of different aspects. Quantitative looks at numbers, qualitative looks at words. The researcher is being objective and taking his objective or her objective position, whereas the qualitative is looking subjectively at the participants' points of views. And so we now talk about the ability to, generalize from quantitative information, but we want to understand context in the qualitative environment. So quite different aspects that you need to consider in understanding those. But there's lots of resources which can help you. If mixed methods are involved, then that will be a combination of quantitative and qualitative within one single research study. So you could, for example, have a survey questionnaire which gets some hard data, and then focus groups would give you some explanations around some of that aspects there. Interviews and focus groups combined don't actually equate to mixed methods because they're both qualitative. So you need to be able to understand the source of the research from there. Another important term to be aware of is research rigor. And so rigorous research is trustworthy, can be relied on by other researchers. And the key concepts there are, as you can see, reliability, validity, and trustworthiness of the research that's been undertaken. So again, different terminology is used, different language is used in terms of quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative, yes, we talk about validity, reliability, generalizability, objectivity, whereas in qualitative we talk about credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So it's looking at the objectivity on the one side, so being free from bias, can be easily replicated. Generalizations can be made. On the qualitative side, it's really looking at the prolonged engagement of that researcher in that environment, the persistent observation in terms of gathering the data, and triangulating the methods. So a few different terminology should be used. So validity, this is relating to the accuracy of the results. So if you're undertaking critical appraisal, these are some of the notions that you need to, I just see, Suzanne, when we do critical appraisal, these concepts will be important. So this is just a brief introduction to them, and this is what you need to sort of read up on during the week to ensure that you do have some sort of deeper understanding of it all. So the accuracy of the results, to what extent does the measurement, for example, a questionnaire or whatever the instrument is, the research instrument, how well does it measure what it is designed to measure? So to extrapolate from that, if another researcher took your research instrument with the same group of subjects, would they get the same responses? And you need to obviously aim for a representative range of responses given the study. While you've got access to QUT, an important resource that you have access to is the SAGE research methods. You can get to that through QUT library, and it's an amazing resource full of definitions, explanations, guidance. So if you feel a little bit vulnerable and unsure about some of the terminology around some of the processes involved in research, make sure that you use this opportunity to drill down a little bit deeper in those areas. Reliability, on the other hand, to validity, relates to the goal of obtaining consistent, stable research results with the potential for replication. So in other words, if you repeat the study, if you did it again, would you get the same results or at least very similar results? And this can be impacted by different situations. So if you're questioning people about somebody who's just watched a TV program on an issue compared to respondents who haven't, you're going to get quite different results as a result of the sort of activities that you undertake. In qualitative research, the trustworthiness aspect concerns more credibility, transferability, dependability. So different language is applied in that. So credibility, how credible is the research? You know, did the researcher just step in for an hour or so, or were they actually engaged for a month, 2 months, 6 months, or whatever it might be? What's the quality, the persistency of the observation of the research subjects within that? Can you be able to triangulate the different techniques to study the participants and their contexts? And we talk about transferability of the findings, so not to generalize from that study to the whole population, but to then consider how transferable is it to another situation. We talk about dependability as well. So in terms of how the research study was subjected, how well articulated is the research methodology and the techniques that are used? How well presented are they in the study that you're actually reviewing? And confirmability looks more at the bias of the researcher. If you have undertaken any sort of qualitative research, are you yourself, have you actually looked, I don't know, I'm trying to think about some of the activities I've been involved with. Do you find what you expect to find? Or actually, are you surprised by the data that's coming out? How do you actually how do your values impact on the research activities that you're going to be involved in? So that's an area where very often in the analysis, if you take, for example, focus group data or something like that, you might include multiple people analysing the data to ensure that it's not just one researcher's bias going into it. As you code the data, you have multiple coders, and you look at intra-coder reliability and things along the way, different ways. Triangulation then allows you to look at the limitations and the strengths of different individual data collection techniques and then bring them together to ensure that they are triangulated, that they support each other, that the findings are confirmed from different angles. So again, take a look at the SAGE research methodology materials to understand that in more detail. There's a few slides here on sampling, just some of the terminology that's associated with that. I don't argue that I'm an expert in the area of understanding sampling, especially in health and research areas, but you need to be able to understand in quantitative studies that generalizability. So whatever you are testing, whatever you're exploring in your research, that it is generalizable to the wider population beyond. So you need to consider sampling methods and you need to consider sample size. So I won't sort of go into this in too much depth, but the language is there for you to be able to consider. Probability sampling looks at the representative samples, the random sampling. Is it a symbol random sample, systematic random, stratified random sample? There's lots of different areas there that you can sort of explore, as opposed to non-probability sampling, which are not representative. They cannot be generalized to a larger group. This is much more in the qualitative study area, where it's a focus on individuals. It's a focus on the what, not the sort of numeric, how much or how many, etc. So different aspects there about the research. Purposive sampling means that you're focusing on a specific group, as in the PICO situation, who are your population, specific individuals. For example, a study into how cancer patients deal with pain will need research participants who A, have cancer, but also B, experience pain. So that's, you're looking for a particular group of people who are going to support you with that research activities. On the other hand, convenient sampling might be just finding key informants who are willing and able to participate in a study, but you need to consider the different criteria such as age, gender, ethnicity, etc., to ensure that you do get a balanced sample of what you need. Sample sizes you'll find when you look at next week and beyond in terms of some of the critical appraisal activities. There's a difference required in terms of sample sizes. Sample sizes tend to be obviously naturally much bigger in quantitative, that's an error in that, I need to correct that. It is quantitative research have larger sample sizes and smaller ones in qualitative. Sorry about that error. So the larger the sample size, the less the sampling error. So very complex studies therefore require even larger samples and that diversity of population rather than a homogeneous population. So those are things that you need to be aware of. Qualitative, however, looks much more at quality rather than quantity. There's no particular sample size that is fixed, but you're seeking to get data saturation. When you keep getting the same findings coming back as you review and analyze, then you have reached data saturation. So that's when no new data, little or no new data is coming through. Randomized controlled trials, Suzanne has just mentioned there. Researchers do sample size calculations to work out how many people they need to enroll in the trial. And if you sort of, I don't know, if you're in the university environment, there's very often, and in the media as well, so just on sort of different radio programs, there'll be calls for participants. You know, can you get involved? Can you get involved in some particular research study based on if it's a purpose of a sample, etc. That, you know, do you have these conditions that you would like to get involved? Time's running out because I really want you to get onto the study design area. Ethical research is very, very important. The whole concept of informed consent, anonymity of the research subject, the confidentiality that the identity is not divulged, and ensuring that the benefits go to the public good and cause no harm or discomfort. And so that those are really, really important things. If you're involved in developing a research project that involves human studies, then there is always the requirement to get ethical clearance. So if you're in a university environment, you'll be aware of your research office that guides and provides that information along the way. If you want to learn more about statements of ethical conduct, then there's a number of them which are directly involved with the research agencies themselves, but then also within universities as well. So make sure that any study does have that ethical clearance to ensure it. But this is the key bit that we want you to get involved in. Research study designs in clinical medicine. If you remember earlier on in the course, we talked about the evidence pyramid and the different types of study design which go into those. Just moving forward, I've got a URL, various study designs that are listed there. Observational studies involve case reports, case control studies, cohort studies. Experimental studies are the randomized controlled trials. Suzanne's just mentioned those. Then there's systematic reviews and meta-analyses. What we have here, and I'll just paste, hopefully, the URL into the box there, so you can click on that. It's just over 12 minutes, which is a good length of time for where we're at in the evening. If you'd like to go off and spend those 12 minutes or so watching this video, Connie Shart is from Duke University and comes to Australia and contributes certainly to the Institute of Evidence-Based Practice that Suzanne is involved in as well. So she has put together a very good overview of the importance of the hierarchy of evidence and how that relates to study design. So 12 minutes or so from here, hopefully we'll see you back and we'll just follow through from there. Okay. Just checking whether most people are back again from that activity. Back. Whoops, I've got to stop my video. Sorry. That was an interesting little bit. That was the next video that came up. Was it time to actually challenge evidence-based medicine? So that's a future topic, maybe at the end of next week to get into. Right, so the material that Connie covered was, so I suppose, encapsulated in the different study designs. Just checking, Suzanne saying our guest speaker wrote up her patient with low leg ulcer as a case study for publication. Exactly. So that gives you a very quick snapshot of the different types of study design, and Suzanne will build on this information next week in the work on critical appraisal of the different types of research articles that you are going to be involved in, and also for assignment 3, of course. Any questions about that sort of aspect of study design? There's a lot of material available about study designs, and it's important for you to understand it. But whatever questions that you might have, then it's important, I think, to clarify some of those over the coming weeks so that you don't feel lost next week when we sort of drill down and do quite a bit more work on critical appraisal of the type of research articles. Could I go back one slide, please? Sorry, did I go back? Yes. Done that? Do you have a question directly, or? I'm not quite sure. Okay. Robin's just typing at the moment. We'll just see what she's got to say. Otherwise, we can move on. She's dropped out of the text box. That's all right. Okay, so that's the slide which covers all of those different types of research activities. So there is another video. We're not going to try and do that today. You can link to that from the website. Okay, now we've got Robin's question. Okay. I just don't understand how a descriptive, let me go back to that slide again, can be analytical is more on the quantitative type of side, or as descriptive. Suzanne, have you got any comments on how that works in practice?
Yes, I do, Jill. It's first of all, I just say to everyone, don't stress out too much about study design. It's really just important to be aware of the terminology. You don't have to be an expert on the nuts and bolts of all the methodologies. But basically, there's the two types of study designs. The descriptive ones are just where the researcher is observing and describing what they observe. So in terms of the PICO elements, the researcher is just looking at a defined population and some possible outcomes. So they might just be looking at let me think, just a defined population of, say, school-aged children, and looking at an outcome of, I don't know, participation in sport or something. They're not looking at any kind of intervention or exposure. Those types of questions sit on the other side, which are the analytic questions. So to use the same example, an analytic question might be, does parental involvement in sport lead to higher participation in sport for school-aged children? So there you've actually got an intervention or an exposure, which is the parental involvement in sport. So you're trying to kind of work out an association or even a cause and effect. So they're just two quite different approaches to research. Does that make it a little bit clearer for you, Robin? Oh, Robin's typing. Still confused. Okay. Maybe we could continue the discussion on the Facebook site, possibly.
Yep.
Because I'm just conscious of the time. Yeah. So maybe if we get onto Facebook. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, that can continue over the next day or so to make sure that everyone understands. But again, there's going to be some good activities, I think, next week as well to potentially, and Suzanne, you can sort of draw on some of this query as you work through some of that next week as well, you know, to make sure that people do understand that sort of difference. So just moving on to Ruth and Catherine, this is in your own time. They presented at the HLA 2012 PD, and their presentation is based on the information that they shared on that. So there's a link to that on the Blackboard site for week 7 if you'd like to go there and make sure that you can have a listen to understand for systematic reviews some of the sort of underpinning foundation, the standards that can go into ensuring that systematic reviews are, as we say, systematic. So that's an extra activity for you to do. I'm going to jump through, I've got the URL there. I'll jump through the next little bit because we're running out of time and think about next week. We always fill up these sessions with too much information. We've realised that. Next week, it is around the critical appraisal of research publications. So Suzanne is going to be our wonderful person on board again. There is some preparation work, and this is what we make sure that you do. We'll be working with 2 documents during the session, and these feed into the assignment 3 where you put some of this new knowledge and experience into practice. But there's a research article, and that's available on the Blackboard site, and there's also a checklist, a critical appraisal checklist. So go to module 3, week 8, and under read, and we need you to have those materials with you for the class. So take time to try and read them in advance if you can, and so that you're well positioned to understand what's going to be worked through during the session next week. And that's really the end of this week. There's been a lot of new material covered this week. We understand that, and we've gone pretty fast through that. Go back, spend time during the week working through the slides again. Look at some of the links, some of the resources that are available to you as well to get a deeper understanding. But as Suzanne said, don't get caught up in the whole terminology. It's more understanding that there is this language and that you need to be able to recognize the different terms that are used in different situations and get some relationship there. Anything, Suzanne, you'd like them to be aware of for next week that you haven't prepared?
I think just to have that material ready. If you get a chance to read the article that would be helpful. But even if you can just have a look at the at perhaps the abstract and the methodology section of the article, if you don't get to the whole article, that would still be useful.
Yes, and then sort of from there, if there's any language or any ideas that you're not very familiar with, do a little bit of background research as well to sort of help inform yourself so that you are feeling confident about the material that will be presented next week. So, good. So that takes us to 8 o'clock. Oh. So don't forget, please listen to or watch the video from Catherine and Ruth, because that's really interesting in terms of where some of the systematic review activities can go out beyond and understand it in a bit more detail. So, good. So on that point, thank you everybody for being there, and we'll see you next week, and hopefully with lots of energy to go for another. It'll be the last week, but there's still lots to talk about before assignment 3 as well. Assignment 2 is all being marked at the moment. But anyway, everyone's off. So good night everybody, and we'll be with you again soon.